terrible here in Kansas. It's just almost pitch black outside. So I like, it's kind of fun living in the Great Plains. You get these massive, huge storms. They don't usually come at 8 o'clock in the morning, but we're under a severe thunderstorm warning, and it's windy, and I got a tree about to fall over in the yard. But anyway, we need the rain. So yeah. Hey, we're going to look at chapter 4, Christ's power and his church. Now, I realize that there's some redundancy in these chapters. Not that any of you ever have a redundancy in your preaching or your teaching. I'm sure that's nothing you ever had, but not really redundancy, but sort of they kind of play on each other. Obviously, if Christ is present with his church, then his power is in his church. Obviously, if Christ has a plan for his church, then he has a purpose for his church. And so I want you to know they actually do build on each other. That's the purpose of this. And for some of us who are pastors, sometimes we look at this and we say, okay, I get that. But my experience has been that leading lay people through this has been really helpful, because it's sort of that truth upon truth upon truth upon truth that by the time they get toward the end of the book really begins to sink in. So I want to make that really clear. I think that's one of the gifts of this book, is that it is the same truth come at from several different angles. And I've seen it happen on numerous occasions, most recently at McElwain, because they're doing this on Wednesdays. They send out the video, they already have given the books to all the members. And on Wednesdays, they send out the video from Henry and sometimes a video from me that sort of makes a McElwain connection. And I've had several of them tell me that this has been, and this is really encouraging to me. I've had several of them tell me that in all of the difficulties they've had at McElwain, I'm going to talk about those at the conclusion today a little bit, because we're right in the midst of it, that this book has been the single most helpful thing to help them navigate through that. And actually yesterday at their town hall meeting, a couple of the members, when they spoke from the congregation and asked questions and made comments, you could tell that they had been influenced by this book, because they were using some of the very kind of language about Jesus and his church. And so I'm really, the more I'm with it, the more I'm around it, the more I'm a big believer that God's really using this for his glory. I think that's pretty cool. All right, Christ's power in his church. And in this one, clearly when Christ shows up to John on the Isle of Patmos in Revelation 1, he doesn't just show up. It's not just his appearance that's important. It's not just his appearance that is critical, but it is the power of his appearance that is different. As we said last time, Jesus and John had seen each other in so many different ways, and John had seen Jesus in every way imaginable, but he had never seen him in this kind of power. Even when he saw him on the Mount of Transfiguration and he was glorified and he was speaking to Elijah and to Moses, he didn't have this kind of power that he had when John saw him. He didn't have the eyes of fire. He didn't have the feet of bronze. He didn't have the sharp two-edged sword coming from his mouth. He didn't have the sun, his face shining like the sun in full strength. And his voice on the Mount of Transfiguration didn't sound like many waterfalls. So John, even though he'd seen Jesus glorified, and he'd seen Jesus after the resurrection on the night of the Sunday night in the upper room, and then several times after that, he had never seen Christ as he was in heaven, seated at the right hand of the Father, with the Alpha, the Omega, having the keys of heaven and hell in his hand. That was a picture that John had never seen. And I think what this chapter says to me, before we begin to sort of go through the different parts of it, is that it's not that we just need to know that Christ is present with us as pastors, but that we understand the power of the resurrected Christ. And I think, obviously Paul understood that. He had seen some of that, remember, on the road to Damascus. Probably not as detailed here as because he was blinded, but he was blinded by that light and heard Jesus spoke. And Paul was indeed fully aware of, and that's why Paul wasn't fearful of death. That's why he could do all the things he did and say to live is great, to die is great, understanding that they could kill the body, but death doesn't kill me. And so he understood the power of the resurrected Christ. And here John sees Jesus in a powerful way. And even though, as Richard says, John doesn't have the human vocabulary to any way at all describe what he sees. So it's not a literal description, clearly. He just has no way of describing the glory, the power, the majesty of the risen Lord. So he tries in human terms as best as he possibly can. But that he'd never seen Jesus in that regard, in that way. And so, yes, we know Jesus has a plan for every church. Yes, we know Jesus is present in every church. And yes, we know he has his purpose in every church, but he is present in his power, all of his resurrected power. And so, sometimes when we pastor a congregation that's declining, we pastor a congregation that has a lack of resources. The building is twice as big as it needs to be. We look on the news and we realize that we're no longer the mainstream of the culture. We're an outlier of the culture. It's easy for us not to see the power of risen Christ. It's easy for us to feel insignificant, unnecessary, marginalized. Do we even matter? And sometimes comparing ourselves to the few churches in town that seem to have it all going. And we look at them and we see they just got thousands of people coming. They got 100 people on their staff. I can't keep a deacon. I can't find one young family that stays. I had lunch with the pastor a week ago. Not this past week, but the prior week. He messaged me here in Kansas City. He's not a pastor I see on a regular basis. And he said, I really am just struggling. I sure would like to spend some time with you. And so I said, sure. So I met him for lunch, and he just began to cry. I mean, I'm sitting there at lunch with him, and he just begins to cry. And so I let him, he gets his composure. He just talks a little bit about COVID and how hard that's been, and how his people have argued over whether they should be back and how they should be back, all that. We've been down that road, but he said it just never ends with the mask and whether we should have children's ministries. And then he said, we're not even half of the attendance we were before COVID. He said, I get some people one week, but then they don't come back the next week. I don't have a consistent number. I don't know what that number is. But then he said this, but Sunday after church, and this is what sort of tricked him. He said, one of my best young families, one of my most committed young families came up to me after church and told me that they love me and that they love this church, but they were leaving, and they were going to another church that was much larger, that had a much more rounded and full children's ministry for their kids. And I let him know that Dr. Rayner, Tom, his initial research indicates that's probably I don't want to make you all depressed, but that's probably going to be more common than we would care to know, that some people are going to use this COVID time as a time to kind of disengage from the church they weren't maybe really sold on anyway. They were already thinking, maybe this isn't the place for us. There's something better across town. And so COVID's a good time to kind of disengage from that. It's a little hard just to walk away one Sunday from the next. But if you haven't been there for several months anyway, and you're really not coming back, this is a good transition time. And believe me, this pastor understood that. And so he was just feeling so deflated and so discouraged. And I again, as a pastor of a church that's maybe not one of the handful that are really just, blowing the doors off. Now, even with COVID, I think that's even going to be more elevated, that sense of, do we really matter, and where is it all going? And this pastor had been there for almost 20 years, and it's still a good church. In fact, he was so discouraged. He just said, I can't go back. I can't preach Sunday. Can you preach for me? And so now you know who he is, because you can look and see where I preached, but I preached for him. He didn't even go to church Sunday morning. So he's feeling a little better this week, but he was at that point. And I just think what we need to understand in those difficult times, and I did encourage him with this, is not his power, not the power of an association or a state convention or a brotherhood, the power of Christ, that Christ that John saw. I mean, John was a prisoner on an island going to die, and yet he was overwhelmed by the power of Christ. And so what we need in these hours as pastors is an understanding, not just of his presence and his purpose and his plan, but certainly of his power in a way we've never seen it before, and the way John saw him, and to realize that what we see around us it's truly not what is there. Now, you know that. I mean, as a pastor, I'm not telling you anything you don't already have knowledge of and have actually taught other people. But some days on Monday mornings, like that pastor had, you need to preach it to yourself, that this is not the end chapter, that what I'm looking at here is not all there is. There's a whole nother world, a whole nother spiritual world. There's a warfare going on, and we're going to win. And Jesus has not left us. He has not forsaken us, and he is present in all of his power. You know, one of the things Richard talks about are rulers of clay. And so we look at the powerful secular rulers and worldly people in this world and all of that. And they're all going to die. They're all going to just go back to what they were, you know, as he said, just they're not going to last forever, but Christ does. And so I think it's important for us to get that eternal perspective on that. But he goes through about four things. He talks about, obviously, with Christ, all things are possible, which we certainly know that, and we preach that and we teach that. But when you talk about the actual and the fact that Christ is eternal and his story is eternal, and we haven't written the last chapter yet, and we're just looking at one particular point in time right here and right now. And when we have an eternal perspective and we look back on what we've done in ministry, we'll see that it all knits together in a wonderful way for his purpose. But he does talk about 3 or 4 issues of how Christ's power in his church is made known. And I think this is important for you to share with your congregation, not just once, but sort of in all of your conversations, to help in times of COVID, in times of attendance decline, in times of struggle. It's one thing for us to all be excited about the power of Christ on those few years when the church is growing and everything's going well. But how do you teach about that, and how do you encourage people in that when the church is declining? In fact, I would say my personal ministry experience has been, I have a better opportunity to really help people understand the true power of Christ in times of difficulty, adversity, even when the church is going through problems, because they can identify in their own life that most of the times in their life, they've got challenges and difficulties, and they would ask the same thing a pastor would. Where is Christ's power when people are leaving my church? Where is his power when things are declining? Where is his power when we become more marginalized even in the culture? And his power is still present and very much alive, just as it is in times of our own personal lives. So this is what he says, and these are all really good. Christ's power, don't forget, will draw people to himself. And we've talked about this on numerous occasions, both with this book and the previous book. And I talk about it, and Richard's talked about it, and pastors for generations have talked about it, and you've talked about it. Jesus said what? If I be lifted up, I'll draw all men unto me. And what we always want to do is we always think we have to have, well, let me just put it to you this way. I believe it was Jared Wilson at Midwestern. I think I heard him say this. I've never forgotten it. You know, all of us, not all of us, but I have. I've been sort of at times in my ministry, back when I was younger especially. I got to tell Jill the other day, I don't think I would like my 30-year-old self. I remember what I was like when I was 30, and I don't think my 60-year-old self would really want to hang out with my 30-year-old self. I think I've gotten a little more sweet, a little more mellow, and a little more everything. I was different when I was 30. Maybe I don't think Stan knew me at 30, but some people at NAM, HMB knew me then, and I could be pretty opinionated and pretty thick-headed. But anyway, in looking at Christ draws people to himself, Jared Wilson talks about, and again, I've done this. I was a youth minister. I was a children's church minister. I was a bus director back in the 70s. So we've done everything to get people to come to church. And Jared Wilson says, you know, on Easter, sometimes churches will have big big giveaways, right? Because you're going to have a big crowd anyway. So you're going to give away an iPad, you're going to give away a bicycle or something like that. And sure enough, out here in Western Kansas, when I was the state missions director one time, we were going to have a big Easter thing and big Easter egg hunt. And we actually got a used car salesman in one of those towns out there to donate a used car. We were going to give away a car. We had more people than we knew what to do with. I mean, if you want to have a big crowd, get somebody to donate a used car, and especially in a poorer part of the community, and say, we're giving away a car. One of these Easter eggs will give away. I mean, it was on the news. It was everywhere. And I remember one time Jared Wilson said, here's the deal. You got to give away an iPad or a bicycle or a car, because the story of a man who died and went into a grave and rose and walked out of it just isn't exciting enough all by itself. It's just not powerful enough all on its own. You have to have an iPad to go with that to make it really a strong. You have to give away a car in order. And, I know, look, I don't want to get an argument with you about drawing people so they can hear the message. I get that. But he is correct. We act as though the message we have isn't enough. And you think about it, it is enough. He's the only person on earth that has ever lived and died and come out of the tomb alive and is alive today, as he told John, and forevermore. What else do we need? And so he will draw men. That message draws men. And the fact that we act like it's no big deal, the fact we act like it's not enough, the fact like that's not a strong enough message is indicative of how our people begin to feel. And it is enough, and he will draw men to him. And we just preached Christ and preached him, as Paul said, dead, buried, and resurrected. We preached the resurrection. If Christ be not dead, Paul said, I above all men am to be most pitied. Don't forget the fact that the resurrection of Christ, the risen Lord, draws men to himself. It's not our power. It's not our speech. It's not our winsome personalities. It's not our logo. It's not our music. It's Christ. It's him and him alone. And so that's an encouragement to us on those months and those weeks when maybe things aren't going well. It is, he will draw them in his time, and he will do that. And it's Christ who transforms people. I look back at on my ministry. I remember my dad saying this when I was a kid, and I never really understood it, or even a teenager. I remember him saying it. And even as a young adult, he said it a lot. My dad was a sweet man, much sweeter than me. And I'm a little more like my mom. She could be a little edgy, but my dad was just one big, wonderful, warm person who never forgot a name and smiled at everybody. And they just called him Brother Harry. Everybody called him, even the grocery store called him Brother Harry. He was just everybody's brother. Everybody loved my dad. My dad had about 3 churches in his life, and all 3 churches tripled in size. I mean, they grew from 100 to 400. And to this day, it's getting a little less so because it's been several years since he's passed away. It's been 20 years since he pastored. But I was in a store the other day here in Kansas City, a flea market, and I was buying some antiques that I don't need. And I noticed the guy had something on the wall from Spickard, Missouri. And I just said, hey, that's my hometown. We talked about names. He was older than me. He was close to 80. And anyway, came up with my dad, and he said, oh, Brother Harry. He said, yeah, he baptized me, and then he married my wife and I, and everybody loved him. Everybody knew him. But I remember my dad, I don't mean to wander here, but I remember my dad used to say, my biggest concern is these people were followers of Brother Harry and not followers of Jesus. And the thing that really disturbed my dad was after he would leave a church a few years, he would check on people, look at people, and some people who'd been very regular and very passionate about the church were no longer involved. And that just really disturbed my dad. He was like, they must have been followers of Brother Harry and not followers of Jesus. And I got to tell you, Facebook is not good for us in that regard, because I had some young families that I saw come to Christ and be baptized in my ministry at Warnell. And I thought, and maybe they still are, but their life pattern now, their choices on social media, they don't go to church anymore. And I'm thinking to myself, were they followers of just Mark Clifton, or were they really followers of Jesus? Because Jesus changes people. Now, you and I both know they could just be in a sort of a carnal, backslidden state, and God could still bring them around. I'm not going to say, we can't say. But you're a pastor and I'm a pastor, and we know if someone isn't involved in church and they're putting things on social media that are not really godly, and they seem to have, you've got to ask the same question: were they ever with us to begin with? Which is what John asked. Were they departed from us? Were they ever with us to begin with? And look, obviously, there were people in the first century who were followers of John and Peter and Paul and not Jesus. It just happens. But the point in all of that is Christ's power transforms people. My personality doesn't transform anybody. My website, my excitement about the ministry of our church, even being involved in serving the neighborhood, that doesn't transform anybody. It can get people to hang out with me. It can get people to sort of be part of what I want to do. It can make me feel good about myself, but it doesn't transform anybody. And so I really think it's important for us to back off and say, listen, and I mean this very sincerely, and maybe this is the most important thing we'll talk about this morning. It really isn't about the numbers you have and you draw. Because trust me, you can have a big crowd, but a few years from now, those same people aren't following Christ. You're going to feel sick to your stomach. You're going to feel like, did I really share the gospel with them, or was I just trying to gather a crowd? Conversely, you can have very few people, but see true change in their life. And decades from now, they're still following Jesus. And you go, yes, that's what it's all about. So I really, look, I don't want to get into quantity versus quality, but man, when you're talking about people's eternal security, quality is ultimately important. And you and I can't change a life. Only Jesus can. And so we trust his power to do that changing. We don't want to try to do it on our own. We don't want to create converts so that we feel better about ourselves, that our churches are growing, that we've got people coming, that we feel positive again. Got to be very careful about that, because it is a terrible thing to look at that and go, were they just followers of me, or were they really followers of Christ? He also says Christ rules the nations. And boy, do we ever need that chapter. I mean, when we wrote this, I don't know, 4 years ago, things weren't like they are today. They weren't good, but they weren't as bad as they are today. I don't really follow the John MacArthur saga. I've got enough saga in my household, and I'll let Big John handle Big John. He's pretty good at doing that. But I did notice, I just read briefly that the county was, I guess there's a land lease. They have a lease on a parking lot somehow or another, and the county was going to revoke that lease. Whatever. They're up to it in their eyeballs with the county. The point of that is 25 years ago, that would never have happened. 50 years ago, that would never have happened. They would just, government and church would just not have been at each other's throat like that. That was something that just didn't happen in our American culture on such a big visible basis. Today, it seems incredibly normal, and like it's just going to get more so. And we all sort of have resigned ourselves to the fact that, as I said, we're not only marginalized, but we're really now sort of the antithesis of what a lot of cities and cultures want. There are a lot of cities that we work with. That's why we're so passionate about replanting. There are a lot of major American cities that don't want churches built because you don't pay any property taxes. So you get 10 or 15 acres that are worth a lot of money in a city, and the city's not going to, and the county's not going to get any property tax on that. So, or sales tax from anything that goes on there, and so on and so forth. And so it's hard for us sometimes. We look at our politics, we look at the decisions that are being made in our courts, and we feel again marginalized. Just like we feel when our churches begin to decline in attendance, just like we feel when it's the same thing. And yet at the same time, we need to understand that he rules the nations, that none of this escapes him, and it's all going to be okay in the end. And Christ's power is greater than the power of any political party or anything else that comes along. And he absolutely rules the nation. He rules the economy, which is the fourth one he talks about. Again, talking about money and what do we have in our church and what we don't have. COVID. I mean, is there a better time to read this chapter than during COVID, when we all don't know what's going on with the government? We don't know what's going on with the rules. We don't know what's going on with our money. Right now, most churches seem to be financially relatively safe and secure. I don't want to be a downer on you, but historically, whenever there's been a financial crisis in North America in the last 100 years, it doesn't generally affect the church for about a year to 18 months later. It takes a while for that. We used to say for that rat to get down the belly of the stomach. It just takes a while for it to to move in that direction. Initially, sometimes people really react well and become even perhaps more generous because they realize of the crisis. But as time goes on, you know, how's that going to look? And as time goes on, for some of us who are losing members during COVID, I think we're definitely going to lose some income. And then for some who are going to lose some elderly patients who passed away during COVID, you're going to lose some income and those kinds of things. And so to understand that God not only rules in terms of who becomes a believer, that he's the one that he draws people, he saves people, he transforms people, we don't. He rules in terms of the political world. Every king, every ruler is subject to him. He is in control. He knows exactly what's going on, and he rules the economy. And he is, as Richard has said, he will resource his plan for his church each and every time. And even though it may look different to us right now, the truth is he is still very much in control of everything, including the economy, even in your church. And then he says, Christ brings the harvest. And that is true. You know, that's why we wear the International Harvester hat. I mean, I could go on and on about that. But the reality is, replanting dying churches is really hard. Planting churches is hard. Pastoring is hard. And sometimes you can go for, look, I know we pick on people. I shouldn't say we. I know sometimes people who maybe haven't had a baptism for a few months or a year can feel really like an unwanted part of the family. Like, you know, we're the problem. You know, we talk about how many churches haven't had a baptism in a year or 2 years. And that, if we talk about that in terms of our concern for them and our care for them, that's one thing. But I think sometimes it comes off as though, you know, you're not living up to the standard and you're not being what you ought to be. And I think some of these guys are trying very hard and working very hard, and it's just a really difficult environment. And so I think at times we just look at it and we say, what happens when we haven't seen anybody come to faith in Christ in a year or 2 years? And I think if we're faithful, now, again, we got to be obedient and faithful. But if we are faithful and we are obedient, then we realize he'll bring in the harvest when he chooses to. And it's just like why I wear this hat. I got to work hard as a farmer. I've got to plow. I've got to plant. I've got to cultivate. I've got to get up early and stay up late. I've got to work through bad weather, all kinds of adversity. But I'm not going to make those crops grow. That is totally up to God to make the crops grow. I can't force that to happen. And so it's the very same thing, Pastor. It's why Paul says, don't grow weary in well-doing. Jesus will truly bring in his harvest. And I mean this with all of my heart. Only eternity is going to show the role you played in bringing in that harvest. You're not going to know this side of heaven exactly how much effort and how much work your work produced in the salvation of some people. And frankly, again, we go back to quantity versus quality. There are going to be some people, I'm afraid, that when we get to heaven, we're going to realize these people were never converted and they are not there. There'll be others that perhaps we'll see that we had no idea we had an influence on their life, but they are converted and know Christ because of some form or another of the ministry that we did. Because at the end of the day, it's his power that converts people. It's his power that draws people. He's the one that brings in the harvest. We don't do it. Look, if it was up to us to bring in the harvest, we would all wear out. We can't do this work. We can be obedient. Let me put it to you this way. You've heard me say it before, but listen up, all right? It's Monday morning, and I know we're tired, and I am too. But here's the deal. We fill the jars. He makes the wine. Remind yourself of that every Monday morning, all right? Like whenever you're willing to quit and walk away, we fill the jars. He turns it into wine. We don't make the wine. It's not our job to make the wine. He'll make the wine. It's our job to do the labor we can do. It's his job to do what only he can do, and he will bring in the harvest. Number 6, he says, God, through his power, protects his people. And that is so true. If we had any notion, if we had any idea how many times God had sovereignly protected us in many different ways, we would be totally overwhelmed. You know, sometimes it's just like that in the Old Testament. If I could just see the army of angels out there, sometimes if I could just have a moment and just really see, and I actually ask sometimes in my prayer, I said, Lord, just help me get a vision of sort of how you're around me right now and how you're protecting me right now and how you haven't ever left me. We fight against things we don't see, and we're not fighting alone. And I just, I know at times we think, man, I've got this issue, I've got that issue, I'm battling this disease, my family's battling that, and that's true. But don't forget, Jesus told Peter, he said, look, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, and to sift you like chaff, rather, and shake you to your core. And I said he could, but I'll always be with you. In other words, I mean this. And sometimes it's really hard to embrace it. But Satan can only mess with us to the degree that God gives him leash to do it. Now, I don't understand how that works. This side of heaven, we're never going to understand how that works. But there is a sense in which God just gives him leash to do those things, and he protects us beyond that. And we have no concept of how many times Satan would have completely destroyed us, devoured us, brought devastation upon us, and not because of anything we did, but only because of Christ's protection. Have we been protected? Daily, no doubt, that happens to us in ways we can't see. And again, when we get to heaven and we look at that, we go, oh my goodness. There I was feeling sorry for myself, feeling like I was alone, feeling like I was vulnerable. And look, there was an army of angels around me, just warding off Satan, warding off all these problems, warding off all these issues, all these calamities daily, not just to me, but to my wife and to my kids and to my grandkids. Far more than we could ever imagine. And so it's important for us every day as we wake up to realize that this risen Lord is not only present with plans and purpose, but in all of his resurrected power. And in that power is the protection. In that power is the ability to draw men to himself. Is that power to truly bring the harvest and convert people. It's not up to us. So on Mondays when we feel weak and we feel tired, we feel worn out, it's okay. It's not up to us. He will do it. It is not, as Zechariah says, not by might or by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. It is not by our own strength that any of this happens. And again, when John had that encounter with the risen Lord, it was different because he'd never seen him in that kind of power. And certainly in this day and age of COVID, in this day and age of cultural antithesis toward us, in this day and age when the church is declining, it just is. It just is. We can argue all day about baptisms and lack of baptisms and why that is, but we are in a dry season right now. God has chosen to put us in ministry, not in the 1940s and 50s when things were blowing and growing, not during some of the great awakenings, not even during the Jesus movement of the 70s, but during maybe one of the most challenging times in the 20th or 21st century. There were some hard times in the 18th century, by the way, in the 19th century. There were times when hardly anybody went to church in North America. And then we had some great awakenings. But the idea that, America was always a place where everybody went to church was not the case. So there have been other dry seasons. But in our recent lifetime, that of my parents and even my grandparents, nothing like this, nothing like we're experiencing. But God chose to put us here. And so one thing it does, it helps us not to rely on our own power. We don't rely on the strength of the Southern Baptist Convention. That's part of the issue. We used to think there's nothing the Senate School Board can't figure out. We used to think there's no problem we have that I can't take a group of people to Ridgecrest and we'll learn how to handle this. There's no problem that the church architecture department can't help me build a building for. Nobody thinks like that anymore. And we just look at it and go, man, I don't know what the answer to this is. Just like that pastor who sat and had lunch with me the other day. And he said, I don't know. And look, coming to the end of yourself and saying it's all Christ or nothing is a really good place to be. And that's really where we have to get. He has questions at the end of each chapter. And I think the end of this chapter are probably his best questions for reflection. So as you deal with your church about this, these questions at the end of chapter 4 are some of the best that are, I think, exploratory questions. I won't take time to look at all of them. But some of the better ones he has here. Take a look here. I don't have them memorized. Yeah, is your church currently behaving according to the reality that Christ is the all-powerful Lord of the universe? Okay, it's one thing to say yes or no, but then he says, if so, list 3 examples. And if not, list 3 ways that could change. So that alone is worth the price of the book. And that is such a Henry Blackaby way of putting it. He comes out and he says, is your church currently behaving according to reality that Christ is the Lord of the universe? Oh, yes, absolutely. Good. List 3 ways how. Well, then list 3 ways, that you should change. And, basically we don't behave as though he's the Lord of the universe. We behave weekly as though everything depends upon us. It all rises and falls with our work and our effort and our money and our resources and our wins and personalities. And it absolutely does not. And that's how we end up making converts to Mark Clifton and not converts to Jesus Christ. We try to do it in our own flesh and our own power. And Satan he'll let us do that all day long. He'll be glad for it. And if we're not careful, we'll count that as success. And that is just the ways of men. And he says, how is God's power being demonstrated in the way that he is drawing people to himself through your church? That's a really important question to ask. Not how are you drawing people by giving away a car or an iPad, or how are you drawing people by having really cool music and a worship leader that can just blow people's doors off, but how are you seeing it being? And so basically sometimes when you don't have great children's ministry, when you don't have great music ministry, and yet you see people come and their whole life is changed, it is sometimes even more affirming in us. And it may not be a lot of people, but you got to look at it and go, man, if it weren't for Christ, that person, we got nothing to offer from a human standpoint. So this must be all of Jesus. And I like this one. How is God using your church to impact the nations? And clearly, if you're a Southern Baptist church, you're part of that. But how are you communicating that? Even though you're a small church, perhaps normative size, how are you weekly, monthly communicating to your church? We're part of a vast missions entity that's doing things all around the world, which is really important. I like there's 5, 7, 8 of them. I'm not going to go through them all. But the last one says, carefully read through Revelation chapter 1 and Isaiah 40. Is your church currently functioning according to truths portrayed in these scriptures? And if not, what adjustments? And I like that. What adjustments? What do you have to do to make that happen so that you begin to live your life in your church as though you truly believe that the risen, powerful Lord in all the glory that John saw him is available to you all the time, every day. And I just, I think that's, if you read Experiencing God and you read even Flickering Lamps, and I didn't read all the stories to you about Richard because those are his stories, not my stories. But if you read those stories, you realize early on, you look back at Faith Baptist Saskatoon and you go, nobody would look at that church and think it was anything. It was just nothing. First of all, Saskatoon is not the center of Canada, let alone the center of the universe. I lived in Canada. Canada has 2 or 3 places that matter, mainly Toronto and Vancouver. Montreal used to matter, but it doesn't really much anymore. And the people in Montreal don't care. They're fine with that. But basically, it's Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. Beyond that, maybe Calgary. And after that, it's just nothing really. It's like, could anything good come from Manitoba or from Saskatchewan? And so here he's in Saskatoon, this little out of the way part. If you think of Saskatoon, just think of North Dakota. I mean, frankly, it's straight north of North Dakota. And, nobody thinks North Dakota is the center of the world. And so he went to this little tiny church in this little tiny town, a relatively small town compared to the rest of North America, and certainly in a province that really, it doesn't have any influence, basically, on its culture. And, this church was dead. You've read the story. The building was a mess. And you would look at it, and if you saw pictures of Henry back in those days, he wore a suit all the time. He just didn't look like, he didn't look like somebody that could be a Pied Piper and would attract lots of people. I'm just frank about that. He didn't have a cool look about him. He just looked like a preacher. Yet what God did in that little tiny church, the power of God that permeated from that, not just in terms of experiencing God, which is just hard for us to even put our minds around, how many millions of people, and even this week, the people at McElwain who've been influenced by this book, 30 years later after all that. But just even in that church, I mean, the fact that Jared Tyone is the leader of the Canadian Convention, and he was really converted and mentored in that church. Paul Johnson's leader of evangelism for the the Canadian National Convention, same thing. And the seminary that's there now, and I could go on and on and on. none of that's of Henry. None of that's of Faith Baptist Saskatoon. All of that is of Christ. And here's what I want you to say, and listen, and tune in and take a look at this, all right? God has allowed us to see the true ministry of Faith and Henry, but I believe we all have that kind. If we're faithful, we all have that kind of heritage. It's just that we're not going to see it fully till we get to heaven. And so I just want to encourage you with that. God has allowed Henry and his family to kind of see it here on earth. I think most of us will never see it until we get to heaven. But we got to understand that it's Christ's power that works through us to do those things that only he can do. And while that little church may look like nothing to the world, it is everything to the kingdom of God. And I will tell you this, you may think, you had a COVID Sunday last week. You had half the people you normally have, and you don't have your children's work. You don't have your music, and your building's 2/3 empty. And, you're not going to get a raise this year. You probably didn't get a raise last year. And you think, does anybody even know our church is here? It just blends into the background, looks like every other church out there. I'll tell you what, this is true. If instead of thunder out there and lightning going on this morning, it was the eastern sky that opened and Jesus had returned, that little church on the corner that nobody pays any attention to would be the most important thing on the planet. It would transform into the bride of Christ. Your members would be the perfected bride. You would meet Christ in his glory. It wouldn't be nothing anymore. It would be the only thing, and that's the future that we have. It's the future that we have. What seems so insignificant and so marginalized today, one day is going to be the center of everything. And that is what you and I lead. And that's why it's important. All right. I will give you a chance to ask some questions, but